Hi, this is Josh Kulp. This is the video for Daf Kaf Gimmel, page 23 of Masechet Kiddushin for Daf Shevui. This video is a little late. I again apologize, as I did at the beginning of last week's video, which you probably got this week because I was away and then there was Pesach. But we're catching up. Next week we should be back on track. The Gemara is moving on here to talk about the non-Jewish slave. All of our discussions of slavery before have been about Jewish slaves, and now we're going to talk about non-Jewish slaves. There are far less verses in the Torah about the non-Jewish slave. There are a lot of verses about the Jewish slave and only a few about the non-Jewish slave. And the tone and the discussion here is very, very different than it was in the previous Dapim. And I want to make a couple general remarks. First of all, I'm reading an excellent book by Jill Lepore called These Truths about American history, and she really talks about how much American history is tied up in the issue of slavery. And she makes a note in the beginning of her book that I think was really very interesting, something I never really thought about, that in American history was the first time that slavery became automatically something that was racial. Slavery has existed probably as long as human history has existed, or at least as long as civilized human history has existed. Slaves in the ancient world were either children of slaves born into slavery, or were taken captive in wars. But it wasn't a racial thing. It wasn't that if you were a certain color, you were automatically a slave. It just had to do with the fortune or misfortune to be born or not to be born as a slave, or to be taken, to lose a war and to be taken as captive. And so I would urge you, that's just one example of the myriad of differences between slavery, as we're, at least if I'm speaking to Americans, familiar with from the inheritance of our own country, and slavery throughout history. This is, of course, not to say that slavery is desirable, but the institution of slavery is a very complicated institution with long history and very different manifestations across different cultures, and is really tied up in the history of humanity. So I would urge you to really think about it without any preconceived notions. You will note like a couple of things. What interests the rabbis here? So the first thing is morality doesn't really interest the rabbis all that much. The rabbis don't seem morally bothered by the existence of slavery. And indeed, we find one rabbi who argues that it's better for a slave to be a slave than to be free. That's probably because his income is guaranteed. And when we think about the position of a starving wage laborer versus a slave whose income and housing and clothing are all guaranteed by his master, it may be that under certain circumstances, people were better off being slaves than they were being wage earners. Again, it would depend on the time, it would depend on the individual circumstance. But the rabbis, in any case, in these discussions, are not really trying to write slavery out of existence. What things are they interested in? They're interested in how kinyan, how acquisition is done. How is a slave acquired? There are certain ways of acquiring a slave, or ways that don't work with acquiring a slave, that they want to compare with ways of acquiring fields, ways of acquiring objects. These include some of the normal manners of kinyan, of acquisition, such as mishicha, physically taking possession of the object, or chazakah, which is presumption of ownership. What can a person do such that it would seem that that person is my slave, and that therefore my claim of ownership would be valid over that person? And there's a symbolic way, which is called chalifin. Today we do this with the pen or with a scarf. You usually do it at a wedding with the ketubah signing. And it's a way of like sort of symbolically transferring ownership. I take something from you that's symbolic, and therefore you exchange it with me for something of real value. Let's say I want to sell you something of real value that is somewhere else. So you give me a pen. I take the pen, and by that I've exchanged it for your cow, which maybe is up in the Golan, where I was, over Pesach. So that interests the rabbis, a lot of discussions on kinyan. Then we find a very long discussion the rabbis are very interested in on how does a slave acquire property, such that he can free himself. How does he acquire a document so he can use the document to free himself, or do others have to do this on his or her behalf? I would probably suggest reading many of these things as theoretical. I think the rabbis are just this is something that's sort of like complicated legally, that interests them, that doesn't really have all that much bearing on how they live their lives. I assume rabbis set slaves free, like anybody would occasionally set their slaves free for whatever reason they decided to do so. But these discussions have a very theoretical whiff to them. As always, I would encourage you to ask questions on our Facebook page. I'm trying to answer usually within a day or two, and it helps participate in an interesting discussion.